So good evening, everyone. I'm not your familiar face. It's Allison here, Chris's cohort, who usually sits off to the side while he does all this, but Chris is busily doing some deliveries for the Festival of Forgotten Grapes, and he will be joining us in a little bit. And I am the one that will be introducing our wonderful featured winemaker, which is great because a woman should be introducing the woman, I think. So I'm really excited to let you guys meet Terah Bajjalieh, who is our winemaker of Terah Wine Co. And I'm going to let Terah, I'm just going to start. I mean, you're sitting outside. I know you muted a little. It's a nice hot day where you are. You're in San Jose area. We always start out with the same question, which is, what was that one aha moment in wine? One of those wines that stood out to you more than others?
Yeah, there's been a lot of those wines, but it's oftentimes me being in certain situations and experiences that are really fun and exciting that I think kind of heightens the wine oftentimes, or who you're sharing those wines with. But when I was first getting started in wine back in 2010, I was studying to be a sommelier, and we were drinking 10, 14 wines a day. It was an amazing experience. And when we got to the region of Burgundy, there was a winery named Domaine de l'Arlo, which I don't recall the exact vintage or the village, but it was so aromatic. It just popped out of the glass. It was really expressive, very elegant, expressive in the sense that you could keep smelling the wine for days, but it was very elegant on the palate, and I think I love wines that are very aromatic, very expressive, but they don't have to knock you over the head with alcohol, sugar, oak, and it was elegant. And I think that is one of the wines early on that really kind of stood out in my experience. So
I think if you guys all want to start drinking, we're going to start with the Vermentino. So you can pour it in your glass. And before we talk about it, Terah, can you tell us how you got your start in the wine business? You said you were studying for a sommelier. Was that a second career move, or how did you get, what were you doing that got you to do this?
Yeah, it was a second career. I studied business and finance for my undergrad at San Jose State, and I worked in mortgage lending for a while. I traded commodities, working for a small brokerage here in the Silicon Valley, and I found myself very bored and very uninspired. I always loved food. I wanted to travel and see the world. And so I started looking at culinary schools, and I went to a few. I went out to New York. I traveled to check out culinary schools. And then I found this wine program that was here in Campbell, California, and decided, as I was trying to figure out what new direction I wanted to take, I decided to just take this sommelier course in hopes that I would be able to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. And I really fell in love with wine in that program. I was learning from master somms who were super excited and very well educated in the subject of wine. And I just gravitated towards it. And that was really when I shifted into wine.
So what was the inspiration to start your own winery? I mean, shifting to wine and deciding to be a sommelier is one thing. Another thing to take on the,
that came many, many years later, in 2010. After working in the industry in various roles, various parts of the industry, after going back to school, I did a master's in winemaking and viticulture in Europe. And when I moved back to the US in 2018, I started kind of climbing the corporate ladder, working for large corporations on their winemaking team, and always had this idea that I wanted to start my own label. And it was the idea was to do just a small project, something that I could express my creativity and kind of pursue the styles of wine that I wanted to make on the side while having a very stable job. But things don't always work out like you think. That stability and that job that I felt like I could build a career with never really came to fruition. And I found myself being laid off and all this stuff, and decided in 2020 during COVID that I was just going to start my own project, and really like putting the foundation down, building the website, figuring out the label design, finding vineyards, all that stuff, which takes time. And it's been a, you know, something that's progressed over the last couple of years, and I've been able to kind of dial in. And it's grown, and I've decided to invest more time and energy into it, and build on the production and scale. And yeah, so it's sort of been a result of necessity and maybe just timing, I think.
The timing doesn't sound ideal in 2020.
No, it wasn't. But uh you know, I was laid off and I suddenly had a lot of time on my hands, and I decided that I was going to take the opportunity to utilize my time for something for myself. And so it really was a positive thing for me. If I was working a full-time winemaking job, it would have been really difficult at the same time to build all this other stuff. And maybe I would have never really taken that plunge. I think sometimes when you're, you know, your back's up against the wall and you're sort of assessing things, then realizing that change needs to happen, I think, is when sometimes really positive things can come about. And that's kind of what happened in 2020. So it was a very small production. I only made 120 cases, and it was more just about getting the business and the foundation set, and having a little bit of wine to go out and talk to people with. So thankfully I didn't have a ton of wine to sell that first year.
Sold it out.
But lots of people were drinking in 2020, so
That's true.
it was definitely doomsday, but people were selling wine in 2020 and 2021. So I wish I would have made more, actually.
Your first vintage was 2020?
Yes.
Okay. So by the time you were ready to sell it, things were starting to open up a little more. Retail stores had found their way, and people were buying online and such like that. Before we jump kind of a little further, we have the Vermentino in our glass, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Vermentino before people finish it and move on to the next.
Yeah, this is a great wine to start. Perfect for warm days, I think. So Vermentino is an Italian variety that's really not common in California, but it comes from the south of Italy and really warm Mediterranean climate. So it grows very well here in California. One of the reasons why I figured this would be a great white wine to make. It comes from the region of Clements Hills, which is out in Lodi. Also very warm and Mediterranean. And Lodi is great for value. Lodi is great for esoteric varieties. There was a lot of Italian and Portuguese immigrants that settled there and planted really cool stuff. So it's actually a pretty exciting region. One thing about all the vineyards that I source from, so I don't own vineyards. I work with growers who sell fruit to me. And you can expect that all of the wines that I make come from growers that farm organically at a minimum. This particular grower is certified organic, but they also farm with biodynamic practices. And, you know, I'm telling you that because I'm committed to great farming and healthy practices for both our environment and human health. And oftentimes when you farm this way, you got to pay more money to farm this way. You have to take a lot more attention to the quality of farming. And that is, you know, a goal in terms of wine production for me. So this comes from Clements Hills. The vineyard is in a low-lying kind of floodplain. It's actually a really cool site. It's the main part of the vineyard is probably about 20 feet above. And then this lower part of the vineyard is actually like a floodplain. So it's really low. It's up against a river, and the soils stay really moist and damp. So it's like a little cooler down there. And this particular Vermentino to me, it smells a bit like Sauvignon Blanc. It's a little grassy, it's zippy. It's not super tropical and fruit forward. For me, it's got aromas of like lemon, kind of lemon pith. And I think it's because it's in that slightly cooler site and the soils are pretty wet down there.
What draws you to the grape Vermentino? I mean, and what other white grapes do you work with, since we only have this one today?
Well, I think when I first started finding vineyards, I was attracted to things that were not so common, because as a small producer with limited funds, you have to figure out ways to be competitive, to be creative, to bring something new and unique to consumers. And everyone makes Chardonnay, and I love Chardonnay, but you know, to make really good Chardonnay that's going to compete in the California market, you need to get really amazing fruit. And that wasn't, and price point, like great California Chardonnay could easily be $50, right? So to me, I had to find value in things that were unique and not so common. And secondly, with temperatures rising, we need to work with grapes that are going to do well with heat. And Vermentino is already climatized to Mediterranean climates. It does really well in heat, and you don't have to, it requires a lot less human input and work in the vineyard as compared to something like Chardonnay, where it's super labor intensive. And so, yeah, I think from an environmental standpoint, it makes sense. pHs, which is what gives you acidity. These types of grapes do better in hot climate, and as the environment just continues to get warmer, things like Chardonnay and Pinot are going to really have a tough time. So it's a little bit of both. It's also really great, like food friendly wine. It smells refreshing. It's definitely like on the leaner side, and then on the palate there's a little bit of texture. It's zippy, it's acidic. Yeah, at the end of the day, I'm trying to make very food friendly, interesting wines. So
It's the
I'm
one
okay.
that's 100% stainless steel, right?
100% stainless steel. It goes through malolactic fermentation, which Chardonnay tends to go through. It gives you a little bit of more creaminess on the palate. But keeping it in stainless steel keeps the aromatics really tight and focused. So
That's interesting. I've heard a lot of winemakers talk about how they think Vermentino is the future and that everyone should be planting Vermentino.
yeah, it's really cool. And this particular grower is planting more and more of it. So I definitely think it's the wave of the future, and a lot of people are starting to work with Vermentino. I do think that it's going to be really hard to come by in the future.
What do you like to pair the Vermentino with? It is really zippy. It's got a lot of acidity. It's got those great floral aromatics, the citrus aromatics.
Yeah, I mean, it's warm right now, so I guess what comes to mind are like cooling salads, fruit, maybe creamier cheeses that have quite a bit of richness and fat, so it'd probably cut through fat pretty well. Maybe like grilled chicken, risotto, like prosciutto, melon, something that's maybe like a little bit salty and sweet. This wine has like a slight minerality to it. Some Vermentinos can be super salty, especially the ones from Italy that are planted right near the ocean. And there's a bit of minerality with this wine. They're maybe not quite so dramatic as some of those Italians, but I think playing off of that salty sweet combination could be really fun. Like a prosciutto.
Yeah, I was in Lodi last week and I went to Juan Antonio's, the one really good restaurant in Lodi. And if you ever go to Lodi, everyone, this is the one restaurant everyone will tell you. But they did a stone fruit Caesar salad, and they had a watermelon tomato salad. And I just keep thinking of both of those salads when I sip this wine. Like they'd be perfect with those summer fruit salads.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Oh, yum. And with the malolactic fermentation, I know that not to be redundant, but just to help a little bit, with malolactic fermentation, it's a secondary fermentation that converts the apple acids into lactic acids. And we know that can cut acidity. What does it do in a grape like Vermentino? This still has so much acidity. Would it be undrinkable without the malolactic, or does this help soften, or what does it do?
I think for this wine, I don't think it would be undrinkable. It might be even better with a little bit more acidity. But I love acid personally. But it wouldn't feel as textured on the palate. Like I do think there's a little bit of oiliness, a little bit of viscosity, and it's not coming from alcohol in this situation. Sometimes it comes from alcohol. But this is from the malolactic fermentation. It just rounds out the palate a bit. It gives it a little bit more weight. I pick early to try to keep those acids in check, but also just to keep alcohols in check. So I think it just rounds it out and gives it a little bit more body.
It's 11.7% alcohol. That's really
Yeah,
low.
yeah, it
And
is.
it's great. And it's got all that kind of, I get the minerality, the kind of lemon citrus, the lime citrus. It's a really fresh wine. It's perfect when it's like 95 degrees outside. So keep enjoying that. And I want to kind of go back. You talked about, that your philosophy, you source from organic, biodynamic vineyards that care about what they're putting in or not putting into the vineyard. What else would you kind of describe as your philosophy when it comes to winemaking? I see that this is unfiltered, unfined. Do you take a very minimal approach? Are there certain things that you do across all your wines, or does it vary red, white, rosé?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes things can change practices, and at the end of the day, I will intervene if I need to. But generally speaking, I'm pretty minimalistic with the wines. I focus on getting really great grapes first. That way I could be a little more hands off, and not manipulate the wines. So I usually don't filter or fine. Fining is where you add a product that basically clarifies it, and it binds to proteins. Sometimes proteins can make a wine a little bit hazy or cloudy, but it's not harmful. It's just protein, like you find in beer, like cloudy beer. So I choose to not fine or filter my wines because I just want to maintain aromatic integrity and maintain texture that is built through things like fermentation, through aging, like malolactic fermentation that we talked about. And anytime you process or you move wine around, you risk losing aromatics or texture, or you risk oxidation. So I really just try to be very protective over the wines and not move them around very much and not process them. I add sulfur to keep them stable, but otherwise, these are all native fermentations. So the yeast that is natural on the grapes in the vineyard is what drives the fermentation. And when over the years, I've been fortunate to travel and to taste a lot of wine, and the wines that are always most complex and most, I guess, uh,
Interesting.
interesting and like memorable are wines that are made with native yeast, and are processed very little, I think. And so in an effort to make like the most exciting, most expressive wines possible, I just try to take a really hands-off approach and get good fruit.
Well, I think it's really interesting because I've never really thought of malolactic fermentation as adding texture to a wine. But it has that sort of texture as if you had stirred the lees or batonnage, and it's really interesting that it comes from the mallow. So
Cool. I'm
I like
glad it comes
that.
across that way.
I mean, Patty thinks it's a delicious wine, so I'm not alone in that.
Thanks, Patty. Thanks, everybody.
Um, um, I guess we can move on and pour the rosé. And while we're pouring that rosé, before we talk about it, are there any particular mentors or individuals who influenced you in this business that, they either influenced you to start making wine or the style that you make?
Um, I don't think my mentors influenced those two things. I won't say that they specifically influenced those things. Uh, Experiences, I think, that I had early on by being able to travel and work in different wineries. And that excitement of being able to see the world through making wine is really what led me down the winemaking track. I always wanted to work abroad and travel, and so winemaking was sort of my avenue for accomplishing that. And that was a really fun period of my life, and it kind of took me down a very different track. A mentor that I had sort of middle way through of traveling was this woman named Julie. She worked at Dumas Winery, and that was one of the first times I think I felt very confident in what I was doing. But what she did was she gave me a lot of responsibility. She allowed me to move very expensive wine around on the forklift and move barrels, and she just kind of let me run with things. And I learned a lot. I learned how to run a cellar. I learned how to manage people, how to get things done effectively, but be graceful and kind to people. And so I would say she was definitely a mentor early on in my career, but she didn't necessarily influence the style of wine that I make, but she influenced how I am with people and how I think and operate in terms of operationally in the winery.
You worked in France, and where else have you worked abroad?
I did 2 vintages in the Marlborough in New Zealand. I did a few vintages in the Barossa Valley, which is in Australia. After grad school, I worked in Burgundy, and I worked in Mendoza, Argentina. I did a lot here in California, like in Napa, Sonoma, the foothills, and then I did one harvest in Oregon as well.
So you've really not only worked in around the world in different continents, but different climates, soils, and grape varieties. You've really run the gamut on everything.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I don't think I worked very much with Italian varieties, and ironically that's what I'm making the most of now. But yeah, I've gotten to experience a lot. It was really a good way to have a broad perspective of winemaking and styles and climate. And it certainly influences what I do here in California.
So this rosé, this is not Italian varieties.
Correct. It's not. It's a little more mainstream. Come back to our comfort levels with Syrah and Grenache. This is from a very special vineyard in the Central Coast here in California. The smaller region is called Paicines. It's a little town, which is the biggest town in this area is that you may know of is Hollister. It's just right across the highway. If you go the other way, you'll hit Watsonville, you'll hit Gilroy. This vineyard is inland towards the mountains, and this area is really great. It's kind of it's a discovered gem, but there's limestone soils out there. Joss Jensen, and his Calera winery are out in this area. So this vineyard is a young vineyard. This is only the second year that we're harvesting fruit from it. And they are experimenting with a lot of things, and they're practicing regenerative farming, so taking organics to a whole other level. And I'm pretty fortunate to get fruit from them because they're pretty selective with who they sell to. So it's Syrah and
Fall
Grenache.
under what
Sorry?
are they under Cienega Valley, or what's their AVA?
It's actually Paicines.
Ah,
If you want to hone in to the specifics, it's Paicines, and there's not a lot of wineries in Paicines, but I think it's part of San Benito County if you go in the larger county.
okay.
Yeah.
So you were saying, so this is a
So this is 40% Syrah, 60% Grenache. Like I was saying before, the vineyard is really small, so there's 2 Syrah rows, and then there's a big block of Grenache. And so I get all of the Syrah, and then I get a little bit of the Grenache, and then the Grenache goes to other makers. And what we do is we harvest it at the same time. So the Syrah is just about ripe, and then the Grenache is just slightly underripe, and that brings like acid and texture. And I wanted to make a more serious rosé, something that has a little bit more texture, not just like easy drinking rosé that sometimes feels like white wine on the palate. I wanted it to be aromatic and stand up to good food. And there's very serious rosés made in like Bandol and Provence and these areas of France that are wines that could be very age-worthy. I think rosé is not just something to enjoy in the summer, like it can be, great rosé. And so I foot tread this wine to give it a little bit more texture, a little bit more tannin, and that's what you might be feeling, that drying sensation. But that helps the wine age longer, I think.
you're fermenting separately the 2 grapes.
Actually, we press them together at once, and then the juice fermented together, so it's co-fermented. Harvested on the same day. I foot tread the Syrah just to give a little bit of that texture, color, and tannin. And then after about 2 hours on skins, you pull a little bit of that color from the skins, and then we put it in the press and separate the skins from the juice at that point, and then it ferments on its own in stainless steel. And this wine also goes through malolactic fermentation, and it ages for 5 months in stainless steel.
I think that's to those out there who are sort of the anti Chardonnay people, because they think it's all buttery and stuff because malolactic has sort of ruined the grape. This just proves you two wines that go through full malolactic. I mean, all the reds we drink do, but with two wines that are so fresh and vibrant and alive that have gone through malolactic, it just shows that if they start out with acidity, you don't end up with a flabby wine.
For sure. You could still end up with something that's like focused and expressive and has tons of acid. You have to pick a little bit earlier to get acidity if you're not adding acid, and I don't add, I definitely don't add acid. So I pick it a little bit early, and it also keeps alcohols in check and stuff too. So, but this particular vineyard always has lots of acidity because of the soils that it's on. So this has more acidity, and it's even higher in alcohol as compared to the Vermentino. So just kind of food for thought.
12.7%, still low.
That's high for me.
I feel like I'm following you because I was in Lodi and then I was in Hollister, and before I came here to Livermore, because I'm on my Northern California tour right now. So, and it is pretty amazing. That's a region. The limestone soils are incredible. It's a really special place, tucked in the middle. Like, it's a sleeper community for Silicon Valley. But it definitely deserves more people to explore it because the limestone soils are incredible. The Pinot Noirs coming out of there are excellent, and clearly Grenache and Syrah do well there too. What would you pair with your rosé? Since it's a little more textured, it's a beautiful wine, and it isn't just you can enjoy it by the pool for sure, but what else would you enjoy it with?
I think pasta would be really great. Maybe something a little bit on the spicier side, like or like a Kalamata olive, maybe like a Greek salad that has like a saltiness and kind of a bitterness from olives. It could be go great with pizza of all flavors, I think. Cheese, charcuterie. I think it would be good with some pretty like hefty charcuterie because it has a lot of acidity. It still has like a lot of fruit too to counteract something that's really on the savory side, I think. So
even going a little more boring, I would do it with some grilled salmon, summer salmon. It has the acidity to brighten up, and then at the same time, not going to overpower anything, but not going to get lost.
Yeah, so even maybe like Thai food, something with like basil, mint, jalapeno, I think would be fun.
It's making me hungry. That's really hard when we do this right at the dinner time.
Yeah.
Some of our resident people that normally come on this who cook and pair are not on tonight because usually they're sharing all their dishes that they've prepared with the wines. But looking at your labels, you've got the most adorable, charming label, and I'm assuming this is supposed to be you.
It's actually, well, the artist kind of went with it and he did make it look like me. But initially it was just me wanting to feature a woman making wine on the label. I hired a French artist. His name's Anatole Zangs, and he does lots of fun, playful characters doing fun things with wine or wine bottles. And so that's his specialty. And that idea came from my time in France, really. I loved the playfulness. Like, you could be very playful but have really good solid wine at an affordable price in France, and so that was the inspiration for this label. I found him and his artwork and decided to hire him. And I didn't give him a whole lot of direction, so he did make it look like me. But the idea was for it to just be a woman. I had to represent and show other women that yes, there are plenty of women winemakers out there. but kind of play into that playful, natural vibe that I loved in France.
Change the skirt color for every grape.
Yep, change the shirt color, the designers and the label. The label people hate me because it's always a lot of work. The wine that's spilling into the glass changes to showcase like what this is the rosé. You guys have the bottles. But yeah, and it's changed a little bit over the years, but trying to hone in on colors and make it fun, you know.
Actually, especially pouring wine, and this might not have been intentional at all, but since you worked as a sommelier prior, there is something about the connection between the bottle and the pouring, and I think there's a nice, you know, combination. At least he didn't put you on a tractor, you know.
True. That would not be nice.
Because I don't know. I mean, I don't know how else you demonstrate that if someone is making wine other than putting them on a tractor or carrying a big thing of grapes over their head.
We started with the idea of a couple people foot treading grapes, but that was, I think, pretty difficult for him to show on a label that was, 3.5 by 5. So we had to kind of pull it back, and then we moved into maybe a person with a thief pulling wine out of a barrel. So it changed a little bit, and this is what we finally settled on.
Very clean and very attractive. It's eye-catching.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, going back, like, what was like your first memory to wine? Like, was wine something you grew up with? Was it something you came to later while you were working? What was your introduction to wine in your own life?
Yeah, I didn't grow up with wine. I think maybe the very first introduction to wine was in college. I worked in grocery stores. That's how I put myself through school. And so when I graduated from college, I didn't land a job in finance right away, so I had to go back into grocery. So I worked at a small gourmet food store called Oakville Grocery. They had one here in Palo Alto, and we had a great wine section. It was all California wine, and we had like great cheese and great charcuterie and a meat section. And that was my first introduction to good, like, specialty food. And the wine section was amazing. And that's when I started learning a little bit about better quality products, really, whether it was food or wine. So that was kind of the beginning part of it. I did take a small tasting class in college just for fun. So those are probably the two first introductions to wine. I drank cheap wine in college. I was a broke college student. I drank like barefoot and whatever it was. I had, I didn't know any better. But it was really through my love of like food and travel that I fell in love with wine, because wine tells you about culture and history. And those amazing experiences are often like paired with great food. So
start with cheap wine.
You could totally do it with cheap wine too. I just prefer better wine now. I'll drink beer.
When they always talk about how the wine industry, oh my God, young people aren't drinking wine. And yes, there are a lot of factors that go into this, and there's the sober curious, and there's other choices. But I always laugh because I'm like, why are you stressed about 20 somethings? No one in their 20s like is concerned about spending money on wine, $30 a bottle. No one. Like, I remember my company party when I was 26 years old, and the first thing we did was go to the bar to get shots. Like, we were not concerned about sipping wine. We were concerned that we could get free alcohol. So I think it's really, when you get to be exposed to wine through, like you said, working in a specialty store, and then, being a little more in the workforce where maybe you're going to dinners or trying things,
Yeah.
Yeah, the 20s are jug wine years. You're right, Patty. I mean, nobody jug wine, cheap wine, like you want it cheap and you want it easy.
Right. Sometimes higher in alcohol because you want more bang for your buck. You feel it the next day though.
Yeah, because of all that residual sugar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a Boone's girl, so I do know that.
And
I'm not sure that Gallo Hardy Burgundy had anything to do with Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
But Patty, you've come so far. Um, so
We all have.
um,
Okay.
we can pour a little of the Pinot Noir, but I'm curious, we're going to move into another region. How do you decide what vineyards to work with, aside from your requirement that they farm responsibly? But you're buying fruit from all over. I mean, today I know we have Lodi and we have San Benito County. Where else are you purchasing fruit?
I have one vineyard in the Sierra foothills, that's Shake Ridge Ranch, which is an amazing vineyard that I get Barbera from. And then there's a few vineyards out in Gilroy, which are part of Santa Clara Valley. This is a really old region, one of the oldest regions of California. And I was working there full time for a couple of years, working for a family, and so I got to know a lot of the local growers that have been farming for generations, and I started finding really old vineyards out there. So it's and it's, right up against the Santa Cruz Mountains. So I have two vineyards in Gilroy. This vineyard where I got the Massa Pinot Noir actually came in 2022 because the vineyard that I usually get Pinot from all frosted over, and he lost his entire Pinot crop. So I had to go find Pinot elsewhere. And this vineyard is pretty famous for its old vine Cabernet that a lot of smaller brands are working with, but the Pinot is just as old. And I probably will never make cab, but Pinot is always something I've enjoyed drinking and enjoy making. So that's why Carmel Valley is on the map today, because I lost my Pinot sourcing. And then there's a couple other vineyards in the San Benito County that I get grapes from as well.
Sort of in that area, in that zone of kind of, I don't know, what do you call it? It's I guess it's the Bay Area.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the San Francisco Bay. I put Santa Clara Valley on the map, which is part of the San Francisco Bay Area, and then I classify the other region as San Benito County, or I get a little more specific with the Paicines Ranch, because Paicines Ranch is doing really cool things with farming, so I'm trying to be specific with that.
Yeah.
I was getting vineyards. I was getting grapes from San Luis Obispo. The first couple of harvests that I got Pinot and Pinot Gris from down there, but then things shifted and I kind of moved up north.
So is it your preference to sort of focus on this area because of the old vines, because of the unique varieties, or is it because of proximity to where you're living? Is it accessibility and price? I mean, are you interested in other regions north of you and even further south?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. I mean, certainly proximity helped, because for the first few years, eventually I got another full-time job. And so for the first few years of building this business, I had a full-time winemaking job running someone's estate. So I had to kind of try to make things easier on myself. So proximity helped. I was still driving an hour sometimes to some of these vineyards, but proximity helped. And I also learned to really appreciate, like, I mean, I get Grenache from a vineyard that's 114 years old, and that is not very common. And the quality is really great. So I just kind of lucked out, I think, in that regard, that it was proximity. I also just started meeting people in the community. Like, I met the people from Paicines Ranch, and they're doing really amazing things. And so I'm okay with working with regions that are maybe not as famous as Napa or Sonoma, but the quality can be just as good. Price point is also really important for someone like myself. I mean, grapes can be extremely expensive in Napa and Sonoma. And so for me, starting a business, I didn't necessarily want to start out making $60, $70 bottles of wine. I felt like it would be really hard to compete in that regard. So I wanted to try to keep my price points low, which is why I work with places like Lodi. Lodi is really affordable. And it helped me build my business. It helped me scale in terms of quantity to be able to save a little bit of money with paying a little less for fruit. But also, these areas are where you find more unique varieties sometimes. Napa, you're not gonna find so much of more esoteric varieties because Cabernet is what pays their bills. And so, you know, it was a little bit of everything, I guess, just trying to piece things together, meeting people. Um, the other important thing about the winemaker relationship is that I wanted to work with people that were going to farm well for me, that were going to be good business partners, because I have no business if it isn't for my growers. And that's kind of a fine line. Like, I don't want to just buy grapes from people. I want to build a business with people that I want to work with, people that I can trust, people that I know are gonna do right by me and do what they say. And starting out small, that can be really tough and competitive. So I chose to kind of also pick the people that I wanted to do business with and that I felt like I could grow with.
It's like an interesting combination because it's picking people you want to grow with, who farm to the standards that you want and that you can communicate with. It's regions that are a little lesser known or less popular, which also helps keep costs down. And then the esoteric grapes. And I guess they all fit together perfectly, because that sort of combines everything you wanted, as opposed to, are you driven more by the vineyard or by the variety when you're looking?
It's first by farming practices. So they first have to be organic or practicing organic. The variety often, sometimes I don't get to pick the variety. It's more about the site and how they're farming that comes first. And or like the woman who's farming in the Sierra foothills, I just wanted to work with her because she's very well respected. She's known for farming meticulously, and everything that comes from her vineyard is usually really high quality. So I just took whatever she would sell me. And you just have to be kind of flexible with that. And little by little, you start meeting new people and finding new vineyards to work with, and you just kind of have to piece things together when you're just getting started, when you don't own land. And that's really what I had to do. So things have kind of grown. The portfolio of wines have grown based off how I've been able to kind of piece that part of the business together.
What's your total case production at this point?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
What's your total case production at this point?
At this point, I'm releasing 1,500 cases annually.
That's a big jump from the 160 you first made.
It is, yeah. This year is going to be the test. If I can sell it all, we'll see. I'm still handling all my own sales in California. So every year I've grown a bit.
And are you selling to any restaurants directly, or is this more direct to consumer?
Yeah, it's predominantly selling to restaurants and wine shops in the Bay Area. And then I have a little bit of distribution out of state, and then a bit of it is done direct to consumer through my website and through my wine club.
Wow.
That's a piece that I'd like to grow more. But I don't have a physical tasting room, so it's a bit hard to connect with people like yourself. But great opportunity to work with wine clubs like yours. Meet new people.
Can you tell us where you're making your wine and what's the facility like? Are you in a shared place, in a custom crush, or?
Yeah, I just moved last year up to a winery in the Richmond, which is in the East Bay area. It's just north of Berkeley. It's owned by a couple guys who have their own brand, and it's a shared facility. So we all get to do our own work, which is what I wanted. I wanted to maintain control over that early on so that I could keep quality up. And there's about six, it fluctuates, but there's about 6 different winemakers in the space. I came in with all my own equipment, but then I share their big equipment, like their forklifts and their presses. And it's a really cool community to be a part of because everybody's excited about wine. Everybody has their own projects. We're all kind of, in the trenches building our businesses together. So it's cool.
And because you have your own material and you're working with your own stuff, obviously, I don't think your style is to use new barrels, but obviously barrels are very expensive. Do you tend to use any oak, or are you stainless steel, or are you using any other aging vessels, concrete or anything else?
Yeah, I use a lot of oak. Most of it is, I haven't bought any new barrels because yes, they are expensive and they can be pretty impactful. But I usually will buy used barrels that are used maybe 2 or 3 times. So it does provide a bit of flavor, but it's usually not overpowering. And so I've picked up bits of barrels here and there over the years as I've grown and as I've needed more storage vessels. So I would say all of the reds are aged in barrel and some of the whites, but most of the whites are aged in stainless steel. So I have stainless steel tanks, stainless steel barrels. They sit on barrel racks, but they provide the same inert environment as a tank would. And then barrels that are the normal 60-gallon size, and then I have a few pungeons for things like the Barbera or the Sangviovese. Those are big barrels. They're they hold about 132 gallons, so they're like 2.5 barrels.
Stainless barrels, they're inert like the tank, but is there something else that happens because of the shape or the size, or it has no bearing?
If I was fermenting in them, I would say they would impact fermentation and maybe aromas a little bit because they're small and they tend to get cold compared to big tanks because they only hold 80 gallons. And so sometimes I do have to ferment in them when I run out of space. So they can control fermentation temperatures. When you have bigger volumes, the temperatures tend to get hotter faster, and that does change flavors, but I usually just age in those. So they sit on racks, they're easy to stack. They sit with the other barrels in barrel rooms. So they're just a little bit easier to move around. And when you have smaller volumes, you know, it gives you a little bit more functionality, I think. I would love to work with concrete or amphora one day, but that's something I'm saving for. Those would be toys for the future.
To bottling, do you guys have a bottling line that you share, or is it a mobile bottling line that comes in?
It's a mobile bottling line that comes in. Yeah. We're bottling next week, actually.
Ooh.
So they usually come out for 2 to 3 days, and you know, whoever wants to bottle and get on the schedule will get on the schedule. And yeah, I bottle twice a year once in the spring. And that's when things like the Vermentino and the Rosé bottled, and then the Pinot and Old Vine Grenache, which were aged for 18 months, so over vintage, those get bottled in the spring, and then in the fall, I am bottling lots of reds and a couple other whites that basically age for 10 months, and then they get bottled in the late summer. And those
And
are
then Patty was just asking which of the wines that you age in the stainless barrels.
those are the Vermentino. The rosé was in a combination of a tank and a barrel. And then I make some Verdejo as well, which also comes from Paicines Ranch. So the same vineyard that grows the Syrah Grenache for the rosé. That is in stainless steel barrels. And I usually make a little bit of Muscat every year, depending on how much volume I get. If it's that vineyard, I always get a really small amount. So it goes in barrel if I only have 60 gallons. It goes in stainless drums if I have 80 gallons. A lot of times it's about volumes. You can't expose your wine to oxygen at any point. So if you don't have enough volume to go in a stainless steel drum, I'll put it in a really small tank that I have. I have like 50-gallon tanks. And if it's too big of volume, then it'll go into a bigger tank and it'll sit in a tank.
You know, the transparency, it is such a light color. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
And
Yeah,
on the nose, I'm getting a little bit, you have stem inclusion in it, right? Or whole cluster?
Yeah, definitely. It's little peppery, little kind of herbaceous and savory, which is what you know, you asked me what was one of the wines that I really fell in love with. It was a Pinot that was made with stem inclusion. Stems also add a little bit of tannin and a little bit of kind of freshness. So this was 100% whole cluster, aged for a year in barrel, and then I put it in stainless steel for 6 months over vintage in those stainless steel drums that we were talking about. So with reds, sometimes you want the tannins to soften, you want to expose it to a little bit of oxygen, which is what you get in barrel. And then when you put it in stainless, you're not exposing it all to oxygen. And one of the things I learned over the years of working with Pinot and Chardonnay producers is they typically will put their stuff in barrel and then they put it in tank. And putting it in tank over vintage just kind of brings the wine back into focus, and it brings the aromatics back, and it minimizes oxygen at that point. So
So this is from Massa Vineyard, and again, where is that?
Massa Vineyard is in Carmel Valley. So this is so you have Carmel Valley, Carmel by the sea, which is right on the coast, right? It's cool, ocean level. There's lots of vineyards over there. And then if you go inland about 30 or 40 miles is Carmel Valley. And it's quite warm. It's tucked in between two mountain ranges. So there's lots of vineyards in the valley. This vineyard is considered Carmel Valley, but it's up on in the Colchagua Valley, which is up on a mountain ridge. So this is about 1,700 feet in elevation. It's pretty hot back there. It's tucked away about you have to drive like an hour in from Carmel Valley, up a one-way road. It was one of the hardest vineyards I had to drive to. And it was planted back in the late 70s and farmed organically since the 70s, which was pretty uncommon. People didn't really practice organics back then. So that was kind of cool. And this is old Gamay clone. So it might taste a little bit like Gamay. It's a little bit more on the savory kind of rustic style, I think. And I think that's the clone and the vine age.
Absolutely. It's very it's got the texture, as you were saying, and it's got that kind of green stemminess to it that gives it an earthy taste. It's not a typical Pinot in certain ways because it's light bodied. Well, it's medium bodied, but on the lighter side, medium minus, I guess you'd say. And yet still has such a mouthfeel. It has texture and lingering. What would you pair a wine like this with?
I think this would be really good with lamb. I love lamb. I know a lot of Americans don't eat lamb.
Lamb with rosemary, because then you'd have the rosemary pull out the herbal parts.
Yeah, something with like dried oregano, rosemary potatoes, roasted chicken with rosemary, I think would be really good. It's definitely on the lighter bodied side, so I wouldn't pair it with a big steak and something that needs a little more tannin and body. But I would say try to mimic that that kind of herbaceousness or that dried spice like oregano and rosemary would be really cool.
Well, Patty and David had it with smoked beef ribs and said it was good. So
cool.
It works with beef.
All right. Fun.
Someone tested it for you.
Good. I'm glad it stood up to beef ribs. Those can be big flavors for sure. 2022 was kind of a tough year. It was really, really hot. We had big heat spikes. And so it got into 110 degrees in this area, which is one of the reasons why I had to pick a little bit early. Pinot has really soft skins and it can fall apart really easily. So if it gets too hot, the grapes just shrivel up and die. So it's partly a little bit on the lighter side because we had to pick it a little early to try to pick before the heat waves came.
So it's an area for Pinot Noir, even though it's a little more inland than Carmel by the Sea. In terms of the grapes that, like, obviously we know Pinot has its certain areas that it grows better in. It needs cooler areas and such. With the other grapes that you're purchasing, why do you think that they thrive in the places that they are? Is it because of the climate? Is it the age of the vines? I know you said Vermentino at the start does well in hotter climates. What happens when we're talking about the Grenache and the Syrah, which can do warmer or cooler climates? What do you like about these climates for these grapes?
For Pinot specifically, or for all of them? For
all of them, just sort of like, are they kind of in the right? Not that they're clearly in the right places, but what do you think these regions do that are so unique to the varieties compared to places we might be more familiar with?
Yeah, I think if we take each variety specifically, I would say the Vermentino is great in Lodi because Lodi is warm, and Vermentino thrives in the heat. But Lodi, the soils are really fertile. Things grow really easily in Lodi. You often get really big crop loads in Lodi because it's just a perfect place to grow grapes. And this grape can be farmed at really high vigor, meaning you can allow the vines to produce quite a bit of fruit, but you still get really good quality. So I think that the climate kind of moderates that type of variety. You know, if you planted Vermentino in maybe a cooler region, maybe you'd have some issues. So I think it makes sense to plant things like Vermentino in Lodi because of that heat. This Syrah and Grenache, you know, this San Benito County is warm. It's not that it's not warm, but it can get really cool at night. I think what's cool about this area are the soil types, and to produce a rosé of Syrah and Grenache, you want lots of acidity, and I think the soil types help with acidity here. And then the hot climates, like in terms of making a red wine from these grapes, I think it would do really well. But the soil types is what makes it a little bit more unique. I get Syrah and Grenache from Santa Clara Valley, which is lots of clay soils, and those wines are a lot more fruit forward and a little bit less savory, a little bigger, like beefier on the palate, coming from clay soils. Syrah and Grenache want heat, and they do pretty well. It does pretty well anywhere, you know. What were you gonna say?
Do well in cool climates. I mean, it's a different style. And Santa Clara, I would make more assumptions that it's a warmer climate. Is San Benito considered kind of a moderate between cool climate and warm because of the cool nights? It retains acidity, or is it still considered a warmer style, a warmer place for Grenache and Syrah?
I would say maybe it's moderate. It's still warm, but it's somewhat moderated by the wind, and it does tend to get frostbitten because of the location. So I wouldn't consider it cool climate though. It's not cool enough for it to be like Santa Cruz Mountains or San Benito County, but it's not quite as hot as like Paso Robles either. But it's warm, you know, it still gets into the hundreds, and that can be challenging. But temperatures do drop at night in this area. So
Especially this last week. This last week has been in the hundreds everywhere.
For sure. For sure. And then it all feels the same, whether you're on the coast or you're inland in San Benito County. It's becoming harder and harder to find distinction, to be honest with you, and to find like differences in our climate. It's just getting warmer and warmer everywhere. So finding varieties that do really well in heat, I think, is going to get even more and more important. So I'm leaning into things that do really well in heat, like Vermentino, Barbera, Sangviovese. These Italian varieties do well. They thrive in heat, and they maintain acidity. So that's sort of the direction I'm going to take in trying to make like food friendly wines that are fresh.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that because it is getting warmer and warmer, but how the limestone soils kind of give the texture and the flavor, and how the soil can have that impact despite the heat. It was hot everywhere, but I have to say I could feel the breezes in San Benito County. There was a wind that blew through every day. Lodi was so hot the wind couldn't even blow. The wind was hotter than the outside. It's 105 degrees, and then there was the wind barely moving. you know,
it's a little stagnant out there sometimes. Yeah.
So, and even here where I am in Livermore right now, there's been a constant breeze, which has been nice, even as it's gotten hotter each day. So, you know, that is a great factor in these warmer climates, is do they have wind and what is their soil? Because that's also going to help the grapes along.
Sure. Yeah.
So we can pour the Sangiovese, since you were just talking about how this is one of the grapes that has the potential in heat. And tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about the Sangiovese.
So the Sangviovese also comes from Lodi. It's a different AVA. It's called Mokelumno River. So this particular vineyard is right next to the river. It's in the back. The river runs through the back of this guy's property. It's the same grower that farms the Vermentino, but this little vineyard is on his father's house, so it's really well maintained. It's beautiful. It's a little bit older too. The vines are about 32 years old, so they farm it with the same practices. It's certified organic, and they practice biodynamic farming here. Tuscany, where Sangiovese comes from, is hot. It's got more hills and it's green and lush, sort of like Napa, Sonoma, but it's hot out there. And so this does really well in Lodi on sandy soils.
It's impressive. It's so light compared to Sangiovese that I'm used to. It's
Yeah.
fresh.
I mean, I do pick a little earlier, because I like wines that are a little bit lighter on their feet than and so, the alcohol is one of the things that makes it a little bit lighter. But yeah, that's just kind of my style. I think you can expect things that are, try to make things that are a little more elegant and fresh, and enjoyable in this hot weather, right? This is maybe still a red wine that you can enjoy with like a slight chill on it. And yeah, it's not going to be like too heavy and too overcoming, I think, with
What do
heat.
you think that Sangiovese has to offer? Is it the high acidity? Is it its food friendliness? I mean, I'm just used to Sangiovese just having
More
more. I
tannin.
like this lighter style. It's an interesting, it's a deliciously interesting Sangiovese.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Sangiovese is cool. It has acid. And you can this I mean, I know producers that make this same Sangiovese, and they'll let it creep up in sugars. It still has nice bright acidity. Sangiovese has fruit. But it also has this, like, sometimes it can be a little bit rustic. Sometimes you get flavors of like iron, leather. If I were to age this longer in barrel and those tertiary aromas kind of come out, it would feel a little more like tobacco and leather. So it can have that like rusticity, but there's always, for me, I get a lot of like bright cherries in Sangiovese, so it's a nice contrast. And even though it's light bodied, Sangiovese still brings a lot of tannin. Like there's still some chewy tannins, but just lighter bodied. And I've always really loved Italian wines for that reason. Like I love Nebbiolos. It's super tannic, but it's really light. And I just like, and I enjoy drinking wines that are a little bit lighter and not so heavy and dense on your palate. So I think that's what I love about Sangiovese. And it's really versatile. I make it in a carbonic style for a client of mine, which is where you keep the grapes whole cluster, and you don't I don't pump it over and work the fermentations, and the fermentations happen inside the grapes, and then it creates a wine that's really bright and very fruit forward, and people love it. And then you can make it in this style where it has a little more tannin. It's maybe a little bit more classic, but not not fully classic, So I just think it's versatile. It's fun to experiment with. I hope that it appeals to a more traditional wine drinker, but it can also appeal to a younger crowd that might just want to drink it with a slight chill on it. So yeah, I hope it kind of bridges that gap.
It's delicious. I think in a blind tasting, I would never guess Sangiovese. I don't know what, I don't know. It doesn't mean it isn't good. In a blind tasting, yes. I mean, I've had, the rustic thing is something I identify with Sangiovese more often, but I love this. Cece had a question. She wanted to know if it's lighter because it's picked earlier, or is that the main reason why it's lighter in color, or is it also where it's coming from?
It's a little bit of both. It's lighter on the palate because there's less alcohol. Alcohol makes things feel a little bit heavier and a little more, we say, like, you feel the glycerol, you feel the alcohol, and it'll coat your palate a little bit more. So it's light for that reason. It's also a little bit lighter because when it comes to fermentation, I don't work the grapes quite as hard, so I might not pump it over. The longer you pump something over or you punch it down and you're extracting more from the skins, it will have more tannin, more texture. So I am probably a little more on the gentle side with fermentations. So it's also a result of that. Lighter in color, I mean, Sangiovese doesn't actually have a lot of color. And it might be also from coming from Lodi and coming from sandy soils. If it was maybe grown on something like clay soils, you might, or a different type of Sangiovese, you might have a little bit more color and more tannin. So I think it's a little bit of everything.
Sangiovese with? Are we going into the pastas and red sauces and
Sure.
a good Tuscan steak?
I think it could go well with a good Tuscan steak. Personally, I don't know. What are you guys all having for dinner tonight?
Stacy wanted to know, do you do all of your reds? Do you do whole cluster on all of your reds or partial whole cluster?
Not all of them, but a lot of them. I do. Yeah, this Sangiovese is actually all destemmed. What you have in your glass is all destemmed.
And the
But
Pinot is what percentage of whole cluster? 100% or not 100?
that year was 100%. Yeah. So, but the Barbera, I do 100% whole cluster. I make a red blend that's Syrah and Grenache, and I leave the Grenache whole cluster and I destem the Syrah. It sort of depends on the variety. But I do love what stems do with wine. It really brightens it up, but it kind of gives like a savory, herbaceous character to wine.
Yeah, definitely. Are you doing all single variety wines or are you doing any blends? Well, you just said Syrah Grenache, but any other blends?
The only blends I do are for the rosé, the Syrah Grenache rosé, and then the Syrah Grenache red wine that I make. At the moment, that's the only blend that I'm doing. So
And
I think it's kind of fun, especially with these unique varieties, to see what they're like and to kind of experience them as true expressions, you know? Especially since they're unique for California. I make Falanghina, which is another Italian white, and I think it's cool to experience on its own.
where are you getting Falanghina from?
The Falanghina comes from an area called Clarksburg, which is just north of Lodi.
Okay. And what other grapes are you working with?
Well, last year I added Aligoté to the mix, which is something that's planted out in Burgundy. So it's similar to Chardonnay, but maybe it's a little more cool and unique for California. Verdejo from Paicines. I didn't necessarily intend on making Verdejo, but it's what they had, and I wanted to work with the vineyard, so I took it. Falanghina, Barbera, um, Old Vine Grenache. So Grenache just from the old vineyard that's planted in 1910. And then every year I usually make a little bit of sparkling, and that tends to be Pinot Chard and sometimes Old Vine Muscat, which is also about 100 years old.
Traditional method sparkling wine or pet nat or both?
I've done all of it, kind of experimented. This year was the first year that I made a traditional method sparkling. It hasn't been released yet. And that blend is going to be Primitivo, which is like Zinfandel from Shake Ridge Vineyard. And she had extra fruit, and so sometimes you just can't say no when people come to you with opportunity. So it's a Primitivo rosé that's blended with the Old Vine Muscat. It's about 115-year-old vines that I get maybe one barrel of, and then a little bit of Chardonnay. The Chardonnay brings the acid down. This is going to be like a wine that I release in a couple of months. We just disgorged it. And my first ever traditional method sparkling.
Your first ever traditional method, you don't do traditional.
That's true. You're very right about that.
I mean, how is Primitivo? The Primitivo is, you said rosé. So how is it as a sparkling wine?
I think it's really nice. The Primitivo from her vineyard has a little bit more tannin, so it does have a bit of tannin to it. But it's not overpowering in any way. It's aromatic. It's got a lot of like raspberry and strawberry. It was fermented and aged in barrel, so the barrel gives it like a nice round texture. I would say it's got probably more body than some of my whites, as to be honest with you. A little more, shoulders, a little more texture. The muscat kind of lifts it and gives it a little bit of floral aromatics, and then the Chardonnay was added for acid and to give it a little bit more focus.
Fun. I mean, that's just different. Very different.
Yeah. They were small lots of, grapes that I purchased, and I started trialing out different blends and seeing what they would be like. I considered just leaving the rosé as a barrel-aged rosé and aging it for a couple of years. And then I started playing around with blends, and I felt like it would be a really cool sparkling wine. So
And it can handle the time of the traditional method, as opposed to doing Charmat or another way.
yeah. Yeah, and I don't have the equipment for Charmat. Sparkling wine is pretty tough to pull off. You need specialized equipment. And so in the past, I just made a lot of ancestral methods and pet nats because I could do it manually without having special sparkling equipment. And then last year when I moved into the East Bay, there's a guy who specializes in sparkling wine, and he has all of the special corkers, and he has all the special bottling equipment. So I made the wine, and then I got to use his equipment, which is one of the reasons why I was able to do a traditional method. When you're making wine in really small batches, the mobile bottling lines it would be so expensive for them to come out to you that it's not really possible. So that's one of the reasons why it kind of evolved from pet nats to traditional method.
Because you don't really have an idea of what it's going to be. I mean, you maybe do by tasting the wine, but it really is playing around to see if it's going to work.
Yeah.
The aromatics of the muscat, I mean,
Yeah. In the past, I did Pinot, Chard, and Muscat. So the past 2 years, that was my sparkling blend that I did in both the pet nat method and also something called col fondo, which is where you age the wine and then you add juice right before bottling. So it's like pet nat, but it's just slightly different. And people always really loved it. And I didn't really love it, but people love the muscat. I think it just makes it a little more interesting. So I knew the muscat would kind of play up to what people typically like, and I've done it in the past, so I wasn't necessarily scared to do it with the Primitivo. The Primitivo as a rosé just had a lot of really bright fruit and nice acidity. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, you don't really know until you blend it and until it goes through that secondary fermentation, and bubbles and carbonation changes things a lot. But you just have to play around and experiment with things. I mean, at the end of the day, you don't know what all wines are going to do. And you have to wait and see how it ages and progresses, and you hope that people like it. It takes years of working with the same varieties, making them in the same styles to really learn and understand how things are going to come across. So these vineyards are all kind of new to me, and it takes some experimenting and pushing the boundaries to kind of figure out what works or doesn't work.
It's really interesting what you're doing. I'm curious. Just I always get confused with this. So I know that you have pet nat it doesn't finish. It finishes first fermentation in the bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Ancestrale is that it's like making champagne where it does secondary fermentation in the bottle. You just don't disgorge it.
Yeah. It's pretty much the same thing as pet nat, pétillant natural or ancestral method.
Okay.
Some people disgorge
rurale,
it.
Sorry, metodo rurale is.
Oh, go ahead.
No, am I correct in that? One of them, what is the one where you do the secondary fermentation in the bottle? Like it's a dry wine, you add the yeast, secondary fermentation, but you don't disgorge.
I think that's method and ancestral method. Yeah.
Okay.
But I don't think you're adding yeast to that unless I'm just not sure of that method.
There's one method where which pet nat is, it's only a first fermentation. It just doesn't, it finishes fermentation in the bottle. And then there's another one I know they do in Italy. It's either Colfondo or
It might be Colfondo, because
Colfondo.
with Colfondo, there could be another term for it. I mean, some of these small villages have lots of terms for
Yeah.
the same thing, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about the same thing. So
many ways to make
method,
sparkling wine.
yeah, for sure. So I did that method last year, and the wine aged in barrel. It went through primary fermentation. It aged for 5 months. It was totally dry. And then I had juice that I kept cold, unfermented. It was the same juice that came from the primary wine. I just kept it in a cold fridge for 5 months. And right before bottling, I added that juice. So that sugar source kicked off another fermentation. And that was undisgorged as well.
Yeah.
But it was a little cleaner because you give the wines 5 months to settle out. And so it's slightly clearer than something like a pet nat where you're bottling it right when it's going through primary fermentation. You often have like lots of sediment and yeast and a little bit of cloudiness. So yeah, I've experimented with all of it. Sparkling is something I have the least experience with. And so I've always only made really small amounts, and in an effort to experiment and learn techniques, and see what people like and see what people don't. And it's super labor intensive, and I don't have employees, so I keep the sparkling wine small and fun, and it's probably not something I'm gonna scale up, because it's pretty simple.
Stacy was asking about your agua fresca.
Yeah, that's a fun sparkling wine. So you're checking out my website, Stacy. So agua fresca is a fun wine that is a sparkling wine. It's a piquette, which is where you take grapes that have already been fermented, and you add, after you make your primary wine out of it, you take those skins and those pumice and you add water to it, and you rehydrate the pressed skins. And so there's still a little bit of sugar, a little bit of flavor, a little bit of tannin left in those skins. So you get another wine from it. It's an old technique that they've made for centuries in France and Italy. And it's a wine for the people. It's wine that they would keep their vineyard helpers and their cellar workers happy with, because culturally they drank a lot in these places, and they let them drink on the job. And so it was something that they made to keep people happy and to enjoy, right? And so a few years ago, this guy in New York stumbled upon this type of his name is Todd, and his brand is called Wild Ark, and he stumbled on this old technique, and he said, well, I'm going to try to do this. And little by little it started to gain momentum here in the US. And so it's called piquette. And so I make a piquette every year, also small production, maybe 100 cases. It's a low ABV wine because you're adding water to something that doesn't have a lot of sugar left to it. It's my blend usually always has Sangviovese, because the Sangviovese brings tannin, color, and acid to the blend. And then I'll make a couple other small batches. This vintage was Grenache and Muscat. The Muscat gives a little bit of, Muscat does cool things. It always brings like the flavor punch, and piquettes can be a little bit watery and on the lighter side. So I think the Muscat adds flavor. And then, so that wine, it ages just like the other wines in stainless steel drums for 5 months so that it can settle out. And I get honey, a really healthy, alive honey from Paicines Ranch, and I add that as sugar source right before bottling. So it goes through secondary fermentation just like regular sparkling wines, but honey is the sugar source. And it's so undisgorged. So it does have a little bit of sediment. It's really bright, refreshing, easy drinking. Like if you don't, on a hot day by the pool, or if you're just having a picnic and you don't want to get super hammered, but you want to enjoy something, I think it's a great wine. And
it goes through a secondary fermentation.
You kind of cut out there. Sorry, I missed the first
Oh,
part.
sorry, it's a piquette. You take the grapes and you add the water and it goes through it. It kind of restarts and does what it does to make piquette. And then you add honey and it goes through a secondary fermentation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like a grapes. It's kind of steeps. It's not a very active fermentation. And you know, I make really small batches, so I just kind of push it down with my hands and it's like steeping tea bags, essentially. You're just trying to pull a little bit more flavor. You have to be really careful about oxygen because it can definitely go rogue and funky. And so you steep it for a couple of days, you repress it, and then you get a wine that's usually around 4 or 5.5% alcohol. And then most people will add back a little bit of wine to it. Just because it can be kind of watery depending on the type of varieties that you use. And it's watery because it's like light in alcohol and there's just not much left in the skins. But so people add back wine. I add honey. Honey gives it a different kind of flavor. Like it can be a little floral, a little smoky even from the honey. So yeah, it goes through secondary fermentation and I don't disgorge it. So I leave the yeast in there. So it's a little bit cloudy. And then I call it agua fresca because, you know, leaning into Mexican culture here in California, like agua frescas are grapes steeped in water. They add a little bit of sugar. It's kind of the same thing. So I'm trying to use a language that Californians know. No, people don't necessarily know what piquette is. And I just thought it would be a little bit fun and playful and feel exciting and festive, you know?
What else do you have up your sleeve for the coming vintage?
What's coming up in this upcoming vintage? I might not change very much this year. I always have lots of changes, but I definitely sometimes opportunities come and different grapes get handed to me. So, I mean, I like to keep it interesting and fun. So who knows what I'll experiment with this year. There's usually a little bit of that because I like to challenge myself in certain ways, but I might do a few different batches of agua fresca just to change it up a bit. We'll see.
Fun. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, Terah, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your wines and your story. I'm going to do a quick wrap up real quick. I'll stop the recording, and then if you want to stay on for a few extra minutes, please do. But I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next month. Outward Wines is going to be our next winery. Another
good. The wines are awesome.
We find them in a nice vein, wineries. But we hope you enjoyed these wines. And for those who joined us at the Festival of Forgotten Grapes, the first one, thank you for joining us. And stay tuned. We'll be announcing the 2025 date soon. And hopefully you'll see Terah there, among other wineries. And have a great evening. Thanks for joining, everybody. It was nice to connect with you all. Hold on, let me stop the recording. There we go.